Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Ron, and today we are going to be going over the Drak Plasma Carbine, its overclocks, and some loadouts that I'd recommend for it, done really quick, the same way that we have been doing these videos in this series. So if you've seen other ones like the autocannon, the minigun, M1000, you kind of know the deal of this. Very first overclock we're going to be talking about is Overtuned Particle Accelerator. This is unstable overclock for the Plasma Carbine. This one gives you a big buff to your direct damage, however it does decrease your overall ammo, it increases the heat per shot, it also makes your spread far worse, particularly your horizontal spread. Your vertical spread is pretty bad too. So here's the way that I build Overtuned Particle Accelerator. In tier 1, I like to go with the cooldown per shot. I would really recommend this one. The other two are decent options too, but I feel like this one's better for this particular overclock. Tier 2, I like going with extra ammo, just so that we can go back up to a normal amount of ammo. You could go with more damage if you want, and maybe a high ammo secondary. That could be an option too. In Tier 3, I like going with the faster cooldown. Honestly, the other two aren't bad here either though. The increased accuracy one doesn't give you that much accuracy, but it's still not a bad option, because the amount of horizontal spread that you have is actually pretty high, and it still remains relatively high with this. But if you want more of a medium range option, that could be one thing that you could go with. In tier 4, I like going with electricity, but all of them are good on this particular overclock. Just depends on what you want. Electricity is really good for single targets, and it also has the slowdown. The plasma splash is really good for crowds, and then the armor breaking is actually pretty good on this particular overclock if you want to take it just to kill big things a little bit quicker. Then I like going with the thermal feedback loop in tier 5. The manual heat dump really doesn't help with this particular overclock, so that one just kind of makes a bit more sense, and it gives us a little bit more DPS. This one does change up the Drak quite a bit. The regular Drak is fairly accurate at most ranges. It kind of struggles at very long range just because of the projectile speed. It's not so bad though, you can still lead your shots and hit pretty easily. It does extremely well against crowds, extremely well against small enemies. It doesn't do the greatest against big enemies compared to Scout's other primaries, but it still does very well. With this particular overclock, it does really well against those enemies like Praetorians and Oppressors. Since this overclock does reduce our range so effectively, then I decided to take a secondary with extra range. I took the crossbow with firebolts. Crossbow with firebolts is really good against crowds. It's also really good for just building up heat onto crowds or onto single targets. You can also just shoot it into the ground and kite enemies around it. Can be really good for clearing off swarmers, although the Drak is also really good for that. I also usually take the firebolts with pheromone bolts so that we can put a pheromone bolt on something and then put multiple firebolts into it to light it on fire. Works really well against Praetorians. That way everything swarms around it and all lights on fire, and you can clear up crowds really easily. The next overclock for the Drak is the thermal liquid coolant. This increases our cooling rate, and it also reduces the heat per shot. This is just an all-around really solid, clean overclock. The way I have it built is the same way as the last overclock, this time for a little bit of a different reason, and honestly, since this is a clean overclock and it just gives you bonuses, you can build this however you'd like. I like going with the faster cooling in tier 1, and in tier 3, this takes forever for your gun to overheat. Extra ammo in tier 2, electricity in tier 4, and then the thermal feedback loop in tier 5, so we get more rate of fire with this. This one, just, you can spray it at absolutely everything. It works really well against crowds. It does just Drak things that the Drak already does, just a little bit better because of all the cooling that it has. It also pairs really well with just about anything since this works so well against most enemies. It is lacking a little bit in single target damage, which is why I decided to take the jumbo shells for the boomstick for this. This allows you to have massive single target damage or even crowd damage, and you're just going to be using the Drak for basically everything at medium to longer ranges, even up to close range for smaller enemies. Then just pull out the boomstick to just kill off big things like Praetorians or Oppressors. The third overclock we're going to be taking a look at is called Impact Deflection. This is a balanced overclock that reduces our rate of fire, but it makes it so every shot can now bounce once. This used to be a clean overclock, and it used to be really crazy because it didn't have any sort of downside. Now it does have one, and it's still really good. This is the way that I built Impact Deflection. Reduced heat per shot in tier 1, extra ammo in tier 2, faster cooling in tier 3, splash damage in tier 4. Splash damage is really good with this one because you can potentially hit next to an enemy, splash damage to it, have the round bounce up, hit them, and then splash again, so you can potentially have 2 splashes with it. It's probably your best option for Scout for just clearing up swarmers. It's really good on Swarmageddon. Then I go with the thermal feedback loop in tier 5 for faster rates of fire. This one is also super flexible. You can build it however you'd like. I would really recommend the plasma splash in tier 4, but everything else, pick whatever you'd like. They're all really good options for this one. It also pairs really well with just about anything for a secondary weapon. I decided to pair this with another solid secondary, which is the Zhukovs paired with gas recycling. This just lets us have some more armor breaking so we can punch through bigger targets, and then just use the Drak for just spraying at any sort of crowd that we see. This can allow you to be super mobile and have tons of crowd control, as well as have pretty decent single target damage towards larger enemies, especially if you're taking something like the IFG as your grenade. Up next we have Shield Battery Booster. This one's a rather unique overclock. This one is an unstable one. This one makes it so we get increased rate of fire regardless of how our shields are. We'll talk about shields in just a second. Increased battery capacity, so we get 100 extra shots, but we have reduced cooling rate, we have more heat buildup, and our overheat duration is twice as long as it normally is, plus once we overheat it breaks our shield. When we do have a fully intact shield, we actually get a big damage buff, as well as we get double the projectile velocity with this. This one is high risk, high reward potentially, or depending on how you see it, or depending on what biome you go into, high risk and minimal reward, as well as it also is more mission type dependent, because if you have shield disruption, this overclock doesn't really do much, and in certain biomes like magma core, the hollow bow, and like fungus bog, this one is kind of rough to use because you're usually taking chip damage in those ones, and so long as you're missing any part of your shield, you don't get the extra bonuses from this. You'll always get the increased ammo, and you'll always get the increased rate of fire, which is kind of nice. There is also kind of a weird bug that goes on with this one if you use manual heat dump on this, which I have. So this is the way that I usually build shield battery booster, going with cooling in tier 1, more ammo in tier 2, cooling in tier 3. You could also go with damage in tier 2. You get enough ammo with this. If you just want to go for full damage, you can do that, and it works really well. I would recommend the coolings in tiers 1 and 3 because this does overheat quicker. Tier 4 we're going with the electricity, but any of them are fine in tier 4. And then manual heat dump in tier 5. This is so that we can overheat our gun on command whenever our bar hits 50% or more. This has a unique function with this particular overclock because if you do overheat it, it does break your shield, but your shield will come back quicker than it otherwise would if you were to fully overheat the gun normally. So it actually kind of helps with shield battery booster, weirdly enough. For a secondary weapon, I paired this with cryo minelets on the Zhukovs. That way we have a little bit more crowd control, so we can freeze things, hopefully at a distance, and then spray into them with the Drak. Shield battery booster does let you have a pretty decent amount of damage so long as you are at those full shields, and it can do really well in just about every mission type. Again, so long as you don't have like shield disruption or you're going to like magma core and there just happens to be a ton of floor fire or something like that. Next up we have our second clean overclock. This is aggressive venting. Aggressive venting is an awesome overclock. This one makes it so whenever you do overheat your gun, it doesn't overheat as long, and whenever you do overheat it, it lets you have fire damage to all enemies around you, so it explodes, dealing fire damage to everything, lighting them on fire or at least building up their heat gauge. And it also fears all enemies within 5 meters of you. That is really nice, and you can luckily trigger this often with the Drak because you can have manual heat dump on it, so you can just keep overheating this whenever you'd like. I really like it with this particular overclock, and I have it built like this. So in tier 1 we're going with extra rate of fire. We don't really need cooldown, and velocity would be a good option, but cooldown's not really necessary with this one. In tier 2 we're going with extra ammo. We don't really need damage because our fire is going to be doing a decent amount of damage. Tier 3 we're going with hot feet because we're going to be overheating this often, so you can keep moving fast whenever you are overheating it. Electricity in tier 4, but honestly any in tier 4 are really good. I like having the extra status effect of having things electrocuted and on fire. And then in tier 5 we're going with manual heat dump, so when we do hit that 50% total heat, we can just overheat this gun, dealing damage to everything around us. It is really useful for kind of doing a kiting technique with this, so just keep moving back from an enemy, and then once you are about to overheat, move into the enemies, overheat it. A secondary weapon, you can take anything you would like with this one. It works really well with anything. I decided to pair it with Specialist with the crossbow and take more special explosive bolts, but realistically you could take whatever the heck you want. They're all really good. Our next overclock is Rewire Mod. This is the overclock that basically gives you infinite ammo for the Drak plasma carbine. It's pretty cool. This one makes it so whenever you overheat your gun, you regenerate ammo. However, your overheat duration is much longer than it otherwise would be, and you also don't have as much battery capacity as normal. That really doesn't matter because you are getting refunded a decent amount of ammo every time you do overheat this, and you do want to overheat it as much as possible. This is the way that I usually build it. So in tier 1 I'm going with extra velocity so we can hit things at a distance because I want to be using this at basically every distance. Tier 2 you can go with ammo or damage. Either one is really good. I'm going with ammo for this one, but the damage is really nice too. You don't need the extra ammo. You'll have plenty if you effectively overheat this. In tier 3 we're going with hot feet because we are going to be overheating this gun pretty often, so we might as well move fast when we do overheat it. You could go with increased accuracy here though too. That's also pretty good with this one. Tier 4 we're going with electricity just so that we can do more single target damage, but again all of them in tier 4 are good. And then we're going with manual heat dump in tier 5, so if there isn't enemies around, we don't have to just keep spraying this into the ground and waiting for it to overheat. We can just overheat it whenever, so long as we hit that 50% heat. For a secondary, I decided to take custom casings with the Zhukov submachine guns. This one just makes it so I can have a ton of bullets with the submachine guns, and I usually run this set with Born Ready. This is my never stop shooting scout build, so you keep firing the Drak until you either overheat it into a crowd or you just need to overheat it manually, then switch to the Zhukovs whenever need be. Spray them because by the time you're running out of bullets with that, or even halfway through bullets, your Drak should be coming off of overheat, so so you can switch back to it and keep firing, and for the entire duration of the Drak fire, and I believe some of the overheat. But then Born Ready will trigger, reloading your submachine gun, so you can always have a gun out and always be firing with this particular loadout. It does help quite a bit. I really find it to be very fun. It works really well against crowds, and it works really well against single targets. It isn't necessarily strongest against big single targets like oppressors, detonators, menaces, stuff like that. You can help with that if you're running crowd grenades, or if you're running IFGs though. If you freeze something, you'll do a lot of damage, or if they're stuck in an IFG, you'll also do a lot of damage, so there is ways around that too. And then for our final overclock for the Drak, we have thermal exhaust feedback. This makes it so once we hit 50% or more of our heat gauge, then we start adding fire to our shots. This will build up the more heat that we have, so we'll be doing more effective fire damage. This does increase our overheat duration by a decent amount, so if we do overheat, it takes longer to come down from that, and it also generates more heat per shot. The way I have it built is like this, so I'm going with increased velocity in tier 1. I think I like this one the best out of the options here. This way you still get heat from it, but it makes it so your projectiles can travel further and you can deal with more long-range enemies. Rate of fire can be a decent option here though too, but you will have to get used to the timing. Then I go with extra ammo in tier 2. The fire is going to be giving us a lot of damage, so we don't necessarily need damage, but it's not a bad option here. Tier 3, I have faster cooling. This is just so that it does cool down when I'm not firing the weapon frequently, or so I can build up the heat gauge a little bit more. You could go with hot feet here though too if you are afraid of overheating this. That does work. In tier 4, I'm going with the electricity. This way we also have fire and electricity. I really like that combination, but any of them in tier 4 are pretty good. And then we're going with thermal feedback loop for this one. That's also an option. I know some people like taking this without any tier 5, which can work too because you don't necessarily need manual heat dump. Some people are afraid they'll accidentally use it and overheat their gun without really any benefit from it. And then the feedback loop can make it a little bit more difficult once your heat starts ramping up in fire. So potentially just not taking a tier 5 can work too for this one. This one actually pairs really well with just about anything for a secondary weapon. I decided to pair it with the boomstick, and I took special powder. This is just so that I have extra mobility. I also put fire on that too, so we have double fire. This wouldn't be as good on like a dreadnought mission, but it should work really well on every other mission type. So this was a general overview of the Drak Plasma Carbine's overclocks. Luckily we got 7 of them. They do change the Drak quite a bit, which is really awesome. And they pair well with most options for a secondary weapon, which is great. There are plenty of options here, and again, this isn't a comprehensive guide for each of these overclocks and how you could play them. Those will be saved for particular overclock videos that we do have planned and that will be out in the future. But thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye!